For 4 long years, Margaret Sinclair lived in a mansion full of wealth, beauty, and silence. Her husband, a powerful billionaire, never touched her, never looked at her the way a wife hopes to be seen. She was surrounded by opulence, yet invisible, a ghost in her own home. And then one evening at a charity gala, everything shifted. A stranger showed interest in her, not for her title, not for her wealth, but for her. And that spark of recognition forced her husband, the man who had ignored her for years, to confront feelings he had buried deep inside. What happened next would change everything. Margaret's world and his forever. Stay with me, because this is not just a story of wealth and marriage. It's a story of invisibility, awakening, and the courage to demand to be seen. Margaret Sinclair stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of her Manhattan penthouse, the soft glow of the early morning sun spilling across the polished marble floors. The city stretched endlessly before her, a mosaic of gleaming glass towers, yellow taxis inching through the streets below, and the occasional pedestrian moving like clockwork through the sidewalks. Everything shimmered with life, movement, and opportunity, and yet she felt like an invisible spectator to it all. She had everything society deemed valuable: wealth, status, designer clothing carefully arranged in her expansive walk-in closets, and a husband whose name commanded headlines, but none of it could fill the void, gnawing at the edges of her heart. Her gaze lingered on the streets below, watching the world awaken. She could see mothers hurrying with children to school, lovers walking hand in hand, strangers laughing and sharing ordinary moments. Moments she had long forgotten how to feel. A sigh escaped her lips almost unheard, swallowed by the vast quiet of the apartment. The apartment was a monument to perfection: gleaming surfaces, sparkling crystal chandeliers, and furniture hand-picked from exclusive galleries. Yet perfection, she had realized, carried a hollow echo when no one looked at you and saw you for who you were. Margaret's reflection in the window startled her. A woman in her late 30s, auburn hair cascading in waves past her shoulders, eyes that had once held the bright spark of curiosity, now dulled with resignation. The woman staring back seemed like a stranger, a life carefully curated and yet achingly empty. For 4 years she had lived in parallel with her husband, Henry Sinclair, a billionaire whose commanding presence and disciplined routine left little room for warmth or intimacy. He had been polite, efficient, utterly brilliant, but not present. His world was steel and marble contracts and boardrooms. Her world had become silence and solitude. She thought back to mornings she had watched him leave, as predictable as clockwork: 5 a.m. The shower, the immaculate suit, the brief nod, and then the door closing, with a finality that left her frozen in stillness. The ritual had once been a source of hope, a hope she could no longer afford to nurture. She remembered the early days of their marriage, when she had tried so desperately to draw him in, learned his favorite foods, prepared meals herself, even attended events she had no interest in, hoping a shared smile or a brief glance would bridge the vast canyon between them. It had not. 4 years had taught her that some distances were impervious to effort, no matter how sincere. Her hands rested on the cool glass of the window pane as she reflected on her life within these walls. She had been told she was lucky, that she had achieved everything a woman could want. But luck, she had discovered, was meaningless when it left your heart untouched. No one noticed the way she lingered in rooms filled with laughter that never reached her. No one asked about her passions, her thoughts, the small joys she still clung to. She was a collection of appearances, a carefully polished accessory in Henry Sinclair's meticulously constructed life. Margaret turned from the window and walked barefoot across the room, the marble floor cool beneath her feet, her silk robe brushing against her ankles. She passed the shelves lined with awards and accolades from galleries she had contributed to, pieces she had created but shared little joy in, for the sense of accomplishment was eclipsed by the emptiness of recognition without connection. Even the art on the walls, the bold strokes, the vibrant colors she had selected herself, seemed to mock her solitude. Each painting was a reminder that beauty alone could not fill the void of being unseen. Her eyes fell on a letter resting atop her vanity untouched. It was an invitation to an art gala, a charity event that promised visibility and engagement. The irony was bitter. She could mingle, be admired, and yet remain unseen in the most profound sense. For the first time in months, she felt a surge of determination rising through the lethargy. If she continued to wait for Henry to notice her, to see her as Margaret Sinclair, rather than as a title or an extension of his own image, she would remain invisible forever. The thought hardened within her like cooled steel. She could not spend another day existing in the shadows of her own life. Margaret sat on the edge of the chaise lounge, fingers tracing the embroidered patterns on the cushions. The silence of the penthouse pressed in, but now it felt less suffocating and more clarifying. She took a deep breath, letting the cool morning air fill her lungs, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine life on her own terms. A life in which her voice mattered, where her creativity and her passions were not sidelined by obligation or neglect. She would seek meaning beyond the echoing halls of the Sinclair mansion, beyond the polished smiles and silent dinners. Standing again, she straightened her spine and allowed a small, defiant smile to curve her lips. Today marked a turning point, subtle yet irreversible. Margaret knew the path ahead would not be simple. Courage was required to reclaim oneself, especially from a life gilded in luxury yet void of connection. Yet she also knew that no art, no accolade, no social approval could substitute for the simple but essential recognition of being truly seen. She had spent 4 years perfecting a life that was all for others. Now she would live for herself. Her reflection in the mirror no longer seemed like a stranger. The green eyes staring back held a flicker of resolve, a tiny spark of rebellion against years of neglect. Margaret Sinclair made her choice. She would no longer drift through the mansion's vast corridors unnoticed. She would seek joy, recognition, and human connection on her own terms. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope, hesitant, fragile, yet undeniably real. And as the city outside hummed with life, she whispered to herself almost audibly, "I will not be invisible anymore." Margaret Sinclair stepped into the grand hall of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the air filled with soft murmurs and the delicate clinking of glasses. Crystal chandeliers glimmered overhead, casting reflections across marble floors and the polished surfaces of the exhibition space. The scent of fresh flowers mingled with the subtle aroma of champagne, creating an atmosphere both refined and inviting. Yet, amid the elegance, Margaret noticed the small gestures that reminded her this was a human space. Laughter, bubbling from a corner, where 2 artists discussed a piece, a waiter leaning down to listen to a patron's question, eyes lighting up, over shared appreciation. She adjusted the emerald gown she had chosen, its hue echoing the green of her own eyes, and smoothed the silk folds at her waist. Tonight, she was not just Margaret Sinclair, the wife of a billionaire who barely acknowledged her existence. She was an individual with a voice, a mind, and a purpose. She had prepared for this evening meticulously, but for once, the meticulousness was about herself, not about meeting expectations. She inhaled deeply, letting the energy of the room wash over her. Her eyes roamed over the art installations, some bold and abstract, others meticulous in detail. A painting of a storm-tossed sea caught her attention. She stepped closer, absorbing the movement of the waves, the turbulence of color and light, the emotion captured in every brushstroke. As she studied the painting, a voice spoke beside her, warm and curious. "Remarkable, isn't it?" Margaret turned slightly startled and found herself facing a man in his early 40s. He had a calm, approachable demeanor, his tailored navy suit understated rather than flashy, and eyes that conveyed genuine interest rather than calculation. "I'm Ethan Caldwell," he introduced himself, extending a hand with ease. "I don't believe we've met before." "Margaret Sinclair," she replied, shaking his hand, feeling a strange warmth in the simple human connection. It had been so long since anyone had approached her with curiosity rather than obligation. Ethan's eyes, attentive and steady, lingered on her expression, encouraging her without intruding. He nodded toward the painting she had been admiring. "I love how the artist captured the power and unpredictability of the ocean. You can almost feel the spray, can't you?" "Yes," Margaret murmured, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "It's almost alive." Ethan's interest shifted smoothly from the painting to her. "And you? What are you passionate about, Margaret? What makes your heart race in a way the world rarely notices?" The question, simple yet profound, startled her. It was a question no one at home had ever asked, not Henry, not the staff, not the guests at those endless social events. She hesitated, then found herself speaking words flowing as if released from years of containment. "I've always loved art, creating programs for children who otherwise wouldn't have access. Painting, curating, exhibitions, mentoring, it's where I feel alive." Her voice, soft yet firm, carried the weight of truth she had long hidden. Ethan listened intently, nodding with thoughtful curiosity, his gaze never wandering, never impatient. He shared his own involvement in educational philanthropy, and for the first time in years, Margaret felt seen, not as Mrs. Sinclair, not as a title or a social accessory, but as a person whose thoughts, passions, and dreams mattered. She felt a lightness in her chest, a fluttering of hope that had been dormant for too long. They moved through the gallery together, discussing artists' techniques and the children's programs Margaret had dreamed of implementing. Each word exchanged felt natural, effortless, and exhilarating. Margaret laughed freely, a sound that startled her by its own rarity. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she realized she was smiling for herself, not performing for others. Across the room, Henry Sinclair circulated among investors and socialites, unaware of the quiet revolution happening nearby. Margaret didn't seek his attention. She had ceased waiting for it. Instead, she allowed herself to be fully present in a conversation that recognized her intellect, her creativity, and her humanity. Ethan paused by a sculpture, turning to look at her with genuine interest. "Have you ever thought about starting a program that brings art into schools that really need it?" he asked gently. Margaret's eyes lit up with an excitement she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She nodded, words tumbling out as she described her ideas, the obstacles she'd imagined, the children she wanted to reach. Ethan listened, asked questions, and offered suggestions, validating her vision without overshadowing it. As they walked to the final gallery, Margaret realized her pulse was quickened, not from anxiety or the expectations of the elite around her, but from the simple thrill of being acknowledged as herself. The sparkle in her eyes returned, subtle but unmistakable, illuminating a part of her that had been dormant in the shadows of wealth and isolation. When the evening drew to a close, Margaret lingered for a moment, savoring the sensation of genuine connection. She had stepped into this exhibition, expecting a display of art, yet she left with a reaffirmation of her own value. It was a small but seismic shift. For the first time in years, she felt recognized, heard, and seen. Not as a wife defined by her husband's achievements, but as Margaret Sinclair, an individual of worth, creativity, and passion. Walking to her car, under the fading city lights, Margaret's heart held a quiet thrill. The penthouse and its marble halls would still await her, but they no longer defined the limits of her life. A spark had been lit, subtle yet insistent, reminding her that she had a right to exist fully, to pursue her dreams, and to be acknowledged for the person she truly was. And for the first time in years, Margaret whispered to herself with resolve and a hint of wonder, "I deserve to be seen." Margaret Sinclair arrived at the modest art studio tucked into a quiet corner of Manhattan, the building itself unassuming compared to the gleaming towers she was used to. The brick walls bore traces of past creativity, paint splatters, sketches pinned in haphazard lines, and the faint scent of oil and charcoal that hinted at countless hours of imagination. It was raw, unpolished, and alive in a way the penthouse never was. She felt an unexpected thrill as she stepped through the door, her heels clicking softly on the wooden floor, echoing through the space like a heartbeat of possibility. Ethan Caldwell greeted her warmly, his eyes lighting up as she entered. "Margaret, I'm so glad you made it," he said, gesturing toward the wide tables stacked with art supplies and folders filled with plans. "I think this could be the start of something remarkable." Margaret smiled, a spark of excitement igniting in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of expectation lifted, replaced with an invitation to create, to contribute, to exist as herself, rather than as a title or a shadow beside a man who barely acknowledged her presence. The studio felt liberating, almost like stepping into a different world, one where her ideas and passions were the currency, not her family name or her husband's wealth. They moved through the studio together, Ethan explaining the vision he had for a series of educational outreach programs. Schools in underprivileged neighborhoods would receive art supplies, workshops, and mentorship from professional artists, offering children an opportunity to explore creativity that they might otherwise never encounter. Margaret listened intently, her mind already racing with ideas, curriculum, lesson plans, engaging the local community, incorporating art history, even organizing small exhibitions for the children's work. Her fingers itched to sketch, to map out possibilities on the large sheets of paper strewn across the tables. "I've always wanted to do something like this," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Art has been my refuge, my voice, but I never thought I could share it in a way that truly matters." Ethan's smile was encouraging, steady and free of condescension. "Margaret, you have the vision and the knowledge. You understand the impact art can have in shaping a child's perspective. We just need someone to guide the project, someone with heart and insight. I think that someone is you." Margaret paused, letting his words sink in. Heart, insight, recognition. It was a language she had not heard at home for years, a validation that was not tied to obligation or wealth. Her mind flickered to the penthouse, to the cold breakfast tables, the silent corridors, the constant sense of invisibility. And now here, in this bustling, imperfect, vibrant studio, she felt alive again. They moved to a corner of the studio where several canvases leaned against the wall, examples from past workshops. Children's bright, uneven strokes and bold color choices told stories more vivid than any gallery display she had ever curated for Henry's collection. Margaret bent down, running her fingers along the textured surfaces, feeling the energy and raw expression captured in each piece. She smiled to herself, a soft exhale, escaping the first she had allowed in months. "I want to be part of this," she said firmly, her eyes meeting Ethan's. "I want to help shape this program, work with the children, guide them. It's what I've been waiting for without knowing I was waiting." Ethan's eyes lit up and he extended his hand. "Then let's make it happen. Welcome aboard, Margaret." For a moment, Margaret hesitated, a flicker of doubt passing through her. Accepting this role meant stepping out fully from the comfortable, invisible cocoon of her married life. It meant creating her own identity, independent of Henry, independent of expectation. But when she looked around at the room, the paint-splattered walls, the canvases bursting with imagination, the tangible energy of creation, she knew there was no turning back. This was the life she had been craving, purposeful, autonomous, meaningful. She shook Ethan's hand, the gesture, simple yet profound. A rush of exhilaration coursed through her as she realized she had just made her first significant step toward independence. This was a conscious choice to be seen, to claim her voice, to contribute to something larger than herself. The spark of possibility that had ignited at the gallery now blazed more vividly, and she felt a fluttering of hope that she had long buried under layers of obligation and neglect. As they began discussing logistics, the schools they would visit, supplies needed, schedules, and potential community partners, Margaret's mind danced with ideas. She imagined walking into classrooms, filled with laughter and curiosity, seeing children discover their own creativity, guiding their hands as they painted, teaching them to find expression and pride in their work. The thought sent a thrill through her chest, a purpose that was hers alone, not defined by her husband's presence or approval. By the time she left the studio that evening, the city skyline glimmered in the twilight, the penthouse no longer looming as a symbol of isolation. Margaret felt a quiet but potent sense of liberation. She had taken her first step into a world where she could exist fully, where her talents mattered and where her heart had space to grow. For the first time in years, she walked with a lightness in her step, her mind alive with plans, her soul feeling the faint but unmistakable pulse of hope. And as she hailed a cab, Margaret whispered to herself, a soft vow carried into the bustling streets of Manhattan: "I will not be invisible, not ever again." Henry Sinclair leaned against the polished marble railing, overlooking the gala hall, his gray eyes scanning the room with the practiced calm of a man used to commanding attention. The chandelier overhead scattered light across the polished floors, reflecting in the sharp lines of his tailored charcoal suit. He should have felt in control. After all, he had spent decades mastering the art of presence, influence, and authority. Yet tonight an unease tugged at him, subtle at first, like the faint echo of a distant warning he could not ignore. Margaret was across the room, standing near a sculpture of swirling bronze and steel, her emerald gown catching the light as she tilted her head, laughing. And it wasn't a polite, measured laugh the way society demanded. It was real, unrestrained, alive. Henry's chest tightened unexpectedly. He knew that laugh. It wasn't for him. For 4 years, it had been absent in their home, a casualty of his distance and preoccupation. Now it rang out in the hands of someone else's attention. He followed her with his eyes as she conversed with a man whose calm demeanor seemed to allow space for Margaret to be herself. Ethan Caldwell, he reminded himself, a philanthropist, artist, and now disturbingly attentive companion. Henry's mind raced, the usual analytical clarity clouded by an unfamiliar thrum of alarm. He had long believed that his wealth, his power, and his indifference would keep Margaret in her place. She had remained dutiful, quiet, unseen, not for lack of spirit, but because he had not allowed space for it to emerge. And now that carefully contained equilibrium threatened to unravel. Henry shifted his weight, trying to steady the knot in his chest. He watched as Ethan leaned slightly closer, listening intently to Margaret's animated words, nodding at her suggestions, gesturing in ways that encouraged her expression rather than interrupting it. Margaret's hands moved freely, illustrating points with graceful motion, her eyes bright and engaged. Henry's throat tightened. He realized almost with disbelief that he had never seen her like this, not really. She was radiant, luminous, a version of herself he had stifled without noticing. A flicker of something sharp pricked at him, jealousy. He hated that he felt it. For so long he had lived by discipline and logic, by the precision of schedules and the measure of results. Emotions were a luxury, and desire was to be controlled, subdued, hidden. And yet here it was unavoidable, the realization that he could lose her. That his inattention, his emotional absence, might have created a space in which another could step in and claim her attention and admiration. He clenched a fist, subtly trying to repress the rising turmoil. The gala carried on around him, conversations about donations, art critiques whispered over flutes of champagne, soft laughter weaving through the polished hall. But Henry felt disconnected, isolated in a storm of unexpected feeling. His gaze did not leave Margaret, and each laugh, each smile directed toward Ethan, carved a new layer of anxiety into him. For years, Henry had maintained a carefully constructed emotional distance. He had believed that showing affection or desire would make him vulnerable, as his father's life had taught him love misplaced could destroy a man. He had avoided intimacy, avoided risk, believing that control and order were protection. Yet now, observing Margaret engaged and alive, he confronted the reality that he had underestimated the consequences of absence. He was losing her. A flash of panic coursed through him. The thought was visceral, an unfamiliar raw sensation, the possibility of Margaret's independence, her emerging identity, her ability to be fulfilled without him. He had not considered that she could thrive outside his sphere, that she could be seen, appreciated, and admired for her own talents. And now here she was, thriving, vibrant, captivating attention in a way that he had never inspired. Henry's hand tightened around his champagne glass, the crystal sweating in his grip. The room's elegance felt suddenly stifling, the carefully orchestrated environment failing to contain the emotional reality that pressed upon him. Every detail, the way Margaret's eyes sparkled when she spoke, the subtle warmth of her laughter, the confident tilt of her head, was a reminder of the void his indifference had created. And with each passing moment, the fear grew, gnawing at the edges of his composure. He realized he had never truly known her, not in the way she deserved, not as a person with passions, ideas, and vibrancy. 4 years of proximity had been illusion, a life lived side by side yet apart, a marriage reduced to appearances and duty. And now, watching her animatedly exchange ideas, watching her inhabiting her own joy, he understood that absence had consequences. He could feel the stakes for the first time, a raw, unmediated awareness of what he might lose if he did not act. Henry exhaled slowly, trying to summon the calm, commanding presence he was known for. But the truth was undeniable. He was really seeing Margaret in a way he had not allowed himself to for years. And the thought that she might continue on this path, radiant and independent without him, ignited a deep, unfamiliar urgency. Margaret laughed again, tossing her head slightly, and something in Henry shifted. The realization settled like cold steel in his chest. He had been ignoring her all this time, and now the consequences were in full view. He could not unsee it, could not unfeel it. His grip on control faltered, replaced with a desperate need to reclaim what he had taken for granted. For the first time, Henry Sinclair understood fear, the fear of losing the one person whose presence he had once assumed he could take for granted. And he knew, in that quiet, elegant, bustling room, that the path forward would demand more than words or perfunctory attention. He had to act, and the possibility of losing her entirely, of watching her light flourish elsewhere, left a hollow ache in his chest that he had never anticipated. Margaret Sinclair entered the penthouse study, the late afternoon sunlight, filtering through tall windows and casting long shadows across the mahogany floors. The room smelled faintly of old leather and polished wood, familiar yet somehow oppressive tonight. Henry sat behind his massive desk, a ledger and tablet open before him, his posture rigid, the gray of his suit echoing the steel in his eyes. He looked up as she entered, a half-smile, flickering briefly, then vanishing. "Margaret," he said, voice controlled, smooth as if rehearsed. "You're back earlier than I expected." "I finished at the studio early," she replied, her tone even carefully measured. She closed the door softly behind her, but the gesture carried weight, a subtle assertion of control over her own space. She had learned over the years that presence was power, and tonight she intended to claim hers. Henry rose, a natural authority in every movement. "I thought we could discuss the gala tonight, maybe plan the upcoming art charity events together." His words were neutral, almost polite, yet they carried an undercurrent of something he didn't fully recognize, a need for connection, a fear he had suppressed for years. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly and she stepped closer to the desk, hands clasped lightly in front of her. "Henry, we need to talk." His eyebrows lifted slightly, curiosity flickering, but he did not yet understand the gravity. "About what?" "About us," she said simply. The words hung in the air, weighty, undeniable. She could feel the tension coiling in her chest, a pressure built over 4 long years of silence, indifference, and absence. "About the past 4 years of our marriage." Henry's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He had avoided conversations like this, believing that distance would protect both of them from discomfort. Yet now, confronted with her calm, determined presence, he felt the first stirrings of unease he could not dismiss. Margaret moved closer to the window, letting the sunlight frame her, her posture resolute. "Do you realize what it has been like, Henry? To live in the same house with someone and feel completely invisible, to exist in a marriage where every day is a reminder that your presence, your thoughts, your desires do not matter." Her voice trembled slightly, though she controlled it, each word precise. Measured, cutting through the distance that had defined their years together. Henry remained silent, watching her. His mind raced, trying to gauge the extent of her anger, her pain, the enormity of what he had neglected. He knew abstractly that she had been unhappy, but seeing her now so composed yet so wounded made the years of his inattention painfully concrete. "You have been gone for 4 years, even when you were physically present," she continued, her hands flexing at her sides. "Dinner tables empty of conversation, mornings spent without acknowledgement, evenings of silence and avoidance. I waited for you to see me, for you to speak to me, for you to acknowledge that I existed beyond the walls of this apartment and the title of your wife." Henry's throat tightened. He wanted to speak, to explain, but no rehearsed line or careful phrasing could bridge the chasm between them. For years he had relied on control, on precision, on avoidance, believing that love could be measured in provision and presence of wealth alone. Yet now Margaret's words pierced through the armor he had built around his heart. "I tried," she said, voice softening though no less firm. "I tried to reach you. I prepared meals, attended functions, smiled for strangers while dying inside. I adapted to your routine, your indifference, your walls. And what did it give me? 4 years of waiting, 4 years of invisibility, 4 years of wondering if I was enough for you ever." Henry looked away, fists clenched lightly at the edge of the desk. He could feel the reality of her suffering in his chest, a tightness that had nothing to do with disappointment or obligation. It was a weight he had never experienced, the awareness of having caused profound, enduring pain through absence and neglect. Yet he was unarmed against it. He did not know how to respond, how to repair what had been lost. Margaret's gaze softened but remained unwavering. "I am not asking for perfection, Henry. I am asking to be seen, to be acknowledged, to matter. Is that too much?" He swallowed the words, caught somewhere between throat and mind. He wanted to tell her he understood, to reassure her that he cared, that he had always cared, but the truth was muddled by years of habit and fear. The phrases seemed inadequate, incapable of encompassing the magnitude of her pain or the depth of his late awareness. She stepped closer, her voice lower, now carrying both sadness and strength. "I need you to know what it felt like. I need you to understand why I cannot continue living as I have. 4 years of absence is not something that disappears with one apology or a fleeting gesture. It has to be acknowledged, felt, and faced." Henry's hands tightened into fists at his sides. The emotions he had long suppressed, fear, guilt, longing, tangled in his chest. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her, to apologize, to explain, to fix, yet each impulse seemed inadequate, clumsy, insufficient. The realization settled in with cold clarity. He had not only neglected her needs, but he had also created a space where someone else might now step in and fill the void he had ignored. Margaret watched him struggle, her eyes reflecting both disappointment and a tentative hope. "I need to know that you understand," she said softly but firmly. "Because I cannot continue like this. I cannot continue to exist in the shadow of a man who does not see me." Henry exhaled slowly, the first visible crack in his composure. He understood her pain, he felt the weight of it, yet he did not know how to bridge the gap. The silence between them was thick with unspoken regret and tentative realization. Margaret's presence, so steadfast and demanding of acknowledgement, was a mirror to his own shortcomings, and for the first time he felt the fear of losing her, not just her attention but her trust, her spirit, her essence. And as the penthouse study's quiet wrapped around them, Henry Sinclair understood in that tense, suspended moment that he could not undo the past, only confront it. But he still did not know how to answer. The silent, piercing question in Margaret's eyes, Would he be able to change in time to reclaim what he had nearly lost? The grand ballroom of the downtown Manhattan hotel shimmered under crystal chandeliers, the polished floors reflecting the gleam of formal coiffure, attire, and glittering jewelry. Waiters moved seamlessly among clusters of investors and philanthropists, offering flutes of champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres, while soft classical music floated from a string quartet tucked into a corner. Margaret Sinclair moved through the crowd with a newfound poise, the emerald gown she had chosen hugging her frame elegantly, her hair swept into a simple yet sophisticated style that drew subtle attention without demanding it. She felt alive every step, a reminder that she was no longer invisible. Ethan Caldwell was waiting near a sculpture installation, greeting her with a warm smile. "Margaret, I'm glad you could make it tonight," he said, offering his arm politely. "I thought we might discuss the program plans and potential sponsors while we're here." Margaret nodded, allowing herself to relax into the interaction. For the first time in years, she felt that someone was listening, not just hearing her words, but understanding the passion and purpose behind them. She spoke with confidence, describing her vision for the outreach program, the way children's creativity could be nurtured, and the long-term impact of introducing art to underserved communities. Ethan listened, asking questions, offering gentle suggestions, and acknowledging her expertise without overshadowing it. Every word he spoke reinforced her sense of worth, her agency, and her identity beyond her marriage. Across the room, Henry Sinclair moved among a group of investors, his posture controlled, his voice calm, but his eyes kept straying toward Margaret. At first it was casual curiosity, a perfunctory check to ensure she was presentable. Then, as he observed her animated expressions, the ease with which she laughed at one of Ethan's observations, and the attentive, respectful way Ethan responded to her, a cold knot formed in his chest. Henry's mind raced. For years he had assumed that proximity and authority were enough to secure Margaret's loyalty, that she would remain dutifully beside him regardless of attention or affection. But now, watching her illuminated by the soft chandelier light, her eyes bright, her smile genuine, he realized how tenuous that belief had become. The spark of life she radiated, not for him, but in the presence of someone else who valued her voice, triggered a rush of emotions he had long suppressed: fear, jealousy, and an unacknowledged longing. Margaret continued discussing the program, moving confidently between tables, engaging potential supporters with knowledge and charm. Ethan's presence was steady, unobtrusive yet supportive. He did not dominate the conversation, did not claim credit, but provided validation. Margaret noticed, and a small private thrill passed through her. She was being seen for herself, and she liked it. The penthouse, the silent breakfasts, the invisible dinners, all felt like distant memories compared to this moment of recognition. Henry approached cautiously, his polished demeanor intact, yet his internal turmoil evident in subtle tension in his jaw and hands. He watched as Margaret gestured toward a young couple interested in contributing to the program, her words animated, her voice confident. Ethan smiled at her, nodded, and stepped back slightly, creating a space that allowed Margaret to shine independently. The sight was simultaneously intoxicating and terrifying for Henry. He stepped forward, entering their small circle, and felt the sudden heat of urgency. "Margaret," he said, carefully measured, "may I have a word?" His tone was polite, but under the calm surface lurked a tidal wave of need he could barely contain. He had waited years to acknowledge the depth of his emotions, and now the possibility of losing her, truly losing her, to a life independent of his influence, drove him to action. Margaret turned toward him, meeting his eyes evenly. There was no fear in her gaze, only clarity and strength. "Of course, Henry," she replied, her voice steady. She had rehearsed nothing, yet her confidence was palpable. She would not shrink, would not allow him to dominate the narrative she was reclaiming for herself. For a tense moment, the room seemed to fade away. Investors continued their conversations, waiters continued their service, but Henry's focus narrowed to the woman standing before him, the woman whose life he had ignored, and whose attention he now fought to reclaim. Margaret felt the weight of his gaze, the urgency, and yet she did not falter. This was her moment, her identity, her choice. Ethan, perceptive and respectful, subtly stepped aside, offering Henry the space to confront his own feelings without diminishing Margaret's agency. Margaret noticed the gesture, a silent acknowledgement that while Ethan's role was supportive, the power of recognition and reconciliation belonged to the parties directly involved. She took a measured breath, centering herself in the midst of tension and anticipation. Henry spoke, voice lower, now carrying the intensity he had long buried. "I've been distant, I know. But seeing you now, thriving, radiant, I realize how much I've taken for granted." His words faltered slightly, honesty slipping through cracks in his polished veneer. Margaret's eyes softened slightly, but she did not forgive instantly. She understood that words alone would not suffice. Her own voice, calm yet resolute, carried across the small circle. "Henry, it's not just distance, it's absence. 4 years of being here and yet unseen, and now you notice, but why now?" Her question was not accusatory, it was a boundary, a reminder of the cost of neglect. Henry's pulse quickened. The room felt suddenly smaller, charged with unspoken possibilities. He recognized the risk, the fragile independence she had cultivated, the power she now held over her own life. For the first time he understood fear, not the fear of failure or loss in business, but the fear of losing the woman he had ignored, who now stood as her own force, separate and brilliant. Margaret, feeling the stirrings of empowerment and recognition, smiled faintly at Ethan, who nodded subtly, encouraging her to stand firm in her autonomy. She had reclaimed her voice, her presence, and for the first time in years felt truly acknowledged. Henry exhaled slowly, realizing that action was necessary, not just for her but for himself, for the marriage he had neglected, for the life he had taken for granted. And in that crowded, glittering room, amid polite conversations and distant music, a shift occurred. The game of presence, attention, and recognition had changed, and Henry now faced a choice that would define the next chapter of their lives. The air remained thick with tension and possibility, leaving every observer unaware of the profound internal reckoning unfolding between the three of them as Margaret's newfound independence shimmered quietly yet undeniably. The soft strains of a string quartet swelled across the polished ballroom notes, weaving delicately through the murmurs of gala guests, the clink of crystal glasses, and the muted shuffle of feet across the marble floor. Margaret Sinclair stood at the edge of the dance floor, a glass of champagne in her hand, her eyes scanning the room with calm awareness. Around her, couples moved gracefully, some lost in laughter, others in silent intimacy. She had attended countless galas in her life, yet tonight felt different. Tonight she was no longer merely an observer of elegance and ritual, she was present, aware, and alive to her own desires. Henry Sinclair appeared at the periphery of the dance floor, his sharp features softened by the low, warm lighting. He paused, watching her move with confidence, the subtle sway of her emerald gown catching the chandelier light, illuminating the curve of her shoulder and the brightness of her smile. For a moment he allowed himself to simply observe, but that brief pause quickly morphed into urgency. Each laugh, each glance, each gesture shared with Ethan reminded him painfully that he had spent 4 years blind to the woman beside him. Without fully realizing how he moved, Henry stepped forward, weaving through the clusters of guests, every step carrying the tension of restrained emotion. Margaret noticed him, and their eyes met, an unspoken understanding passing between them. The world seemed to slow, the music rising in her chest, her pulse matching the rhythm of the quartet. There was history in that look, but also possibility. The tension in the air was palpable, charged with years of neglect and the promise of reclamation. "May I have this dance?" Henry's voice was lower than usual, husky with vulnerability, the question carrying weight far beyond the etiquette of a gala. Margaret hesitated, a subtle smile tugging at her lips, curiosity flickering in her green eyes. For years she had been invisible to him, relegated to shadows and polite acknowledgement. Now he was asking, not commanding, asking for her presence, offering something rare, recognition, and a claim born not of control but of need. She placed her glass on a nearby table and allowed him to take her hand. His grip was firm yet careful, neither domineering nor dismissive. The moment their hands met, a current of unspoken tension passed between them and the world outside. The circle of the dance floor fell away. Margaret felt herself breathing differently, attuned to the small movements, the subtle cues, the raw sincerity in Henry's expression. They moved onto the floor, joining the gentle sway of the surrounding couples. The music guided them, but it was the space between their bodies that defined the rhythm now. Henry's hand rested lightly at the small of her back, anchoring yet respectful, while her other hand lingered in his fingers, intertwined in a tentative yet growing trust. Margaret felt the past 4 years pressing into the space around them. Absences, unspoken resentments, silences that had stretched into infinity. Yet she also felt something new, the deliberate, vulnerable presence of Henry choosing to enter her world fully, not as a shadow or a distant figure, but as a participant willing to risk emotion. The contrast was startling, the vulnerability disarming. Henry's voice broke the silence between the music, soft and urgent. "Margaret, I have been blind. I didn't know. I didn't realize what I was losing." His eyes searched hers, seeking acknowledgement, perhaps forgiveness, but mostly recognition of a truth he had ignored. Seeing you tonight, seeing you alive, radiant and independent, it terrifies me. I will not let you slip away from me again. Margaret's chest tightened. The words were unexpected, raw and sincere. She felt the sting of the past, the neglect, yet the vulnerability in his admission struck a chord. The authority, the composure, the carefully constructed distance here dissolved into honesty. Her pulse quickened, and she felt an unusual flutter of hope, cautious yet undeniable. They moved together across the floor, bodies attuned to each other and to the music. Margaret began to mirror his movements, responding to his rhythm with ease that surprised even her. Every step, every subtle gesture of connection reinforced the realization that he was choosing to be present, not out of obligation, but out of a deep human need. As the first crescendo of the quartet rose, Margaret felt herself soften, allowing her guard to drop fractionally. The warmth in Henry's eyes was an unspoken apology, a confession of years wasted and a pledge to change. She allowed herself to respond, not with full surrender, but with cautious curiosity, a willingness to explore what could be, to test the sincerity that had previously been absent. Around them, the gala continued oblivious to the small revolution unfolding on the dance floor. Guests conversed, clinked glasses, and admired the elegant atmosphere, but the world for Margaret and Henry had contracted into a circle of shared space, movement, and attention. Every subtle glance, every gentle step toward each other, carried weight, history, and potential. The music softened in a quiet passage, and Margaret realized that she was smiling, genuinely, feeling an emotion she had long forgotten. Not only had Henry pulled her onto the floor physically, but he had also drawn her into a shared moment of vulnerability and recognition. The tension of years of absence, the ache of invisibility, gave way slightly to the tentative but profound thrill of connection. As the final notes of the string quartet floated into silence, Margaret felt a quiet exhilaration pulse through her. She had trusted, if only a little, and the response from Henry had been sincere, immediate, and grounded in honesty rather than obligation. The moment hung between them, charged, delicate, and full of possibility, leaving both aware that their journey had only just begun. And in that suspended beat of awareness, Margaret's heart whispered softly, almost to herself, maybe he sees me now. The drive out of Manhattan felt like shedding a layer of expectation and tension. Margaret Sinclair watched the city skyline recede behind the tinted windows of the car, the honking horns and neon signs fading into memory, as the urban landscape gave way to rolling hills, pine forests, and the quiet hum of rural roads. Henry sat beside her, silent, for much of the ride, but she could feel the subtle shift in his energy, a presence that was no longer distant, no longer filtered through the lens of power and propriety, but quietly attentive. Arriving at the lake house, nestled among towering pines and overlooking a placid glass-like lake, Margaret felt a serenity she had long forgotten. The air smelled of earth and water, crisp and clean, untouched by the concrete and steel of her usual world. The house itself was modest, warm in its wooden simplicity, with windows that framed the water and allowed the sun to spill in freely, creating a space that invited comfort rather than display. For the first time in years, Margaret felt she could breathe without constraint, unobserved, unjudged, free to exist as herself. Henry set down the luggage, glancing toward her, with a soft, uncharacteristically nervous smile. "Welcome to the weekend," he said simply. There was no flourish, no performance, just an invitation to presence. Margaret returned the smile, sensing that the weight of past neglect had begun to ease, at least temporarily. Inside, the kitchen smelled faintly of pine wood and herbs. Margaret lingered by the counter, examining the cupboards and the organized chaos of a home designed to be lived in rather than displayed. Henry, without announcement, began preparing a simple meal: scrambled eggs, fresh fruit, coffee brewing on the counter. He moved with care, attentiveness that had been absent in their shared years in the penthouse. Watching him, Margaret realized she had never truly seen him like this, relaxed, competent, focused not on business, but on the act of caring for her and for the space they now shared together. She allowed herself a small, incredulous smile. "You cook?" she asked, teasing lightly, though there was genuine warmth in her voice. Henry glanced over an amused but modest shrug accompanying his smile. "I do when it matters," he replied softly. "And this matters." His eyes held a rare openness, unfiltered by the walls he had built around himself for so long. Margaret felt a flutter of hope. She recognized that he was not performing for her approval but engaging genuinely, an effort born of intention and care rather than obligation or show. They ate together in the quiet light of the lake house. No staff, no guests, no distractions. Conversation flowed easily, sometimes punctuated by laughter, sometimes quiet, thoughtful pauses. Margaret shared her vision for the art programs, her fears about overcommitting the challenges she had imagined. Henry listened, genuinely invested, offering insight and support without asserting control or judgment. The exchange felt revolutionary to her, a testament to the possibility of connection built not on hierarchy, but on mutual respect and attention. After breakfast, they moved to the lakeside dock. Margaret dipped her hand into the cool water, smiling at the ripple that spread across the surface. Henry stood close, silent, letting her space remain unintruded. Yet, his presence was grounding, comforting, a reminder that he was present not as a distant overseer, but as a partner sharing the same space and moment. Later in the kitchen, Margaret watched as Henry chopped vegetables for a small dinner. He moved with deliberate care, humming softly, attentive to details she had never witnessed before. There was a tenderness in the way he arranged the ingredients, measured the portions, and adjusted the heat of the stove. Margaret felt a warmth rise in her chest, a mixture of surprise and gratitude. For the first time, she saw Henry acting in service of something other than his own pride or ambition. He was caring, thoughtful, present. She found herself moving closer, offering to help their hands, brushing lightly as they passed ingredients back and forth. Laughter punctuated the silence, gentle and easy. Margaret felt a connection forming in real time, a sense of partnership that had been absent for years. It was not dramatic, not theatrical, just quiet, real, and deeply satisfying. She realized that love could be built in moments like this, small attentive gestures, shared laughter, the simple act of caring for another human being. As evening settled, they sat on the porch overlooking the lake. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of pink, gold, and lavender. Margaret rested her head on Henry's shoulder, listening to the soft rhythm of his breathing, the occasional call of a bird across the water. She could feel the tentative rebuilding of trust, the gradual thawing of distance, the emergence of intimacy born from understanding and shared presence rather than grand gestures or words alone. Henry spoke softly, almost as if to himself. "I want this to be right, for us to actually know each other, not just live side by side." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining naturally, and Margaret felt a shiver of reassurance. For the first time, she sensed that his words were matched by action, by attention, by a genuine commitment to the slow, deliberate work of loving someone fully. The night deepened around them, stars beginning to shimmer over the lake. Margaret breathed in the cool, earthy air, feeling a peace that had been absent for years. The penthouse, the endless routines, the silent dinners, all of that felt distant, now replaced by a space where they could learn to love each other anew, each step a conscious choice rather than a reflexive expectation. And as she watched Henry hum softly to himself while setting a small pot on the stove for their late-night tea, Margaret felt a quiet thrill, a seed of hope taking root in the fertile soil of cautious trust. She allowed herself to lean into the moment, recognizing that the journey had only just begun, yet for the first time she believed it could succeed. The lake reflected the early evening sky, calm and inviting, a mirror to the possibility blooming between them, leaving Margaret with a sense of quiet anticipation, wondering what the next steps of this delicate, deliberate reconnection might hold. The cabin by the lake was quiet, bathed in the warm glow of the late afternoon sun streaming through the wide windows. Wooden beams crisscrossed overhead, and the soft crackle of a fire in the stone fireplace added a comforting hum to the stillness. Margaret Sinclair sat on a woven rug, her hands cradling a cup of tea, eyes tracing the gentle ripples on the lake outside. The day had been unhurried, filled with shared laughter, cooking, and conversations that carried both honesty and reflection. For the first time in years, she felt entirely present in her own life, her heart light yet brimming with anticipation. Henry Sinclair approached quietly, carrying a small velvet-covered box. He paused for a moment, observing Margaret as she stirred the tea absent-mindedly, the sunlight highlighting the green of her eyes and the soft auburn of her hair. There was a vulnerability in his posture tonight, a conscious shedding of pride and perfection replaced by an openness that matched the gentle intimacy of the cabin. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice low and steady, yet carrying an intensity that made her turn toward him immediately. "I know we've been through a lot. 4 years of mistakes, distance, and absence. I want to change that. I want us to start something real, something we both choose every day." Margaret's heart quickened, her fingers tightening around the teacup. She could see the sincerity in his eyes, the quiet determination that had been growing in increments since the weekend began. She wanted to believe him, to allow herself the hope she had tentatively nurtured over the past days. Yet she remembered the years of absence, the invisible dinners, the silences that had defined their early marriage. Henry knelt before her, the small box in his hands, opening to reveal a simple platinum band set with tiny emeralds that mirrored the depth of Margaret's eyes. "This," he said, his voice catching slightly, "represents more than a commitment. It represents choice. Not a contract, not obligation, not appearances, but a conscious, deliberate choice to love you, to honor you, and to build a life together on respect and understanding." Margaret felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. The gesture was understated yet monumental. It spoke of thought, attention, and the deliberate intention to do things differently. Her mind raced through the past, the years of being unseen, the silent corridors, the hollowed-out hope, and now contrasted with the man kneeling before her, offering a promise shaped by awareness, by vulnerability, by a willingness to learn and grow. Henry," she whispered, her voice trembling despite the effort to steady it. "I can't." Her hand rose hesitant, and he gently took it, slipping the ring onto her finger beside the original engagement band. The emeralds caught the firelight, sparkling with understated brilliance. "The old ring," Henry said softly, "represents the past, what we were. This one is what we are becoming. Someday maybe we'll only need the new one. For now, let it remind us of the choice to show up, to be present, and to love deliberately." Margaret's chest swelled with emotion. She looked at him, the man who had ignored her for years now, kneeling with openness and reverence, and a rush of relief, joy, and deep connection washed over her. She nodded a soft, decisive yes, escaping her lips, carrying with it a promise not of perfection, but of willingness to be vulnerable, to trust, and to meet him in shared intention. Henry rose, taking her hands in his, their fingers intertwining naturally. A wave of tenderness and exhilaration coursed through both of them. The firelight flickered across the room, dancing on their faces as if reflecting the new energy of their relationship. One built not on expectation or status, but on recognition, respect, and deliberate affection. Margaret traced the curve of the ring on her finger, feeling the weight of symbolism and sincerity. It was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a manifestation of choices made consciously, a daily commitment to care, to communicate, and to nurture the fragile yet potent bond they were now cultivating. The intensity of the gesture made her heart ache with gratitude and love, tempered by the humility of knowing how far they had come to arrive at this point. They embraced slow and deliberate, each holding the other in a way that spoke of reassurance, reverence, and the acknowledgement of shared vulnerability. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the world outside, reduced to the soft murmur of leaves against the lake, the gentle crackle of the fire, and the quiet of a space, finally made sacred by intention. For Margaret, the moment was both culmination and beginning, a recognition of past pain, and the first step into a renewed, deliberate love. She could feel the weight of history, the echo of past neglect, but it no longer constrained her. In its place there was possibility, hope, and a tangible commitment that extended beyond words. Henry brushed a strand of hair from her face, his thumb tracing her cheek with care and reverence. "I am yours," he whispered, "and I will spend every day proving it. Not just tonight, not just in grand gestures, but in the small, quiet choices that matter." Margaret leaned into his embrace, allowing herself to absorb the profound emotion that radiated from him. She felt seen, valued, and cherished in a way that had been absent for too long. Her heart, once tentative, now swelled with a mixture of relief, joy, and anticipation for what lay ahead. Outside, the lake reflected the evening sky, calm and infinite, as if bearing witness to the silent vow they had exchanged. Margaret pressed her forehead against Henry's chest, closing her eyes, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and allowed herself to imagine a life built on choice, connection, and love, consciously nurtured. And in the quiet intimacy of the cabin, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the gentle hush of the lake, Margaret felt a profound surge of emotion, a bated breath that spoke of joy, possibility, and the beginning of a love redefined. The morning sunlight spilled through the north-facing windows of the penthouse studio, painting the walls with soft gold light that mingled with the vibrant colors of Margaret Sinclair's easels and canvases. The room, once a quiet sanctuary of solitary reflection, now pulsed with shared energy. Henry Sinclair sat beside her, sketching preliminary designs for a community art exhibit, while Margaret added bold strokes to a canvas of her own creation. The air was fragrant with turpentine, fresh paint, and a faint hint of coffee, the ordinary sense of creation that now carried extraordinary meaning. Margaret glanced up from her work, meeting Henry's eyes across the studio. There was a calm intimacy in the exchange, a silent acknowledgement of shared presence that had been absent for far too long. Neither words nor grand gestures were needed. The simple act of being together, attentive and fully engaged, carried more weight than any spectacle could. Her hand traced a bright swath of color across the canvas, and Henry's gaze followed the movement, appreciating not only the art, but the woman creating it. Breakfast had been a quiet affair that morning, shared over fresh fruit, crusty bread, and lightly scrambled eggs. Conversation flowed naturally, discussing plans for the outreach program, the schools they would visit, and the children they hoped to inspire. Laughter punctuated the discussion, gentle, unforced, and genuine. Margaret realized with a small private thrill that these ordinary moments, once hollow and perfunctory, were now infused with intention and meaning. After their meal, they walked through the gardens surrounding the penthouse, the early morning air crisp and fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers. Henry reached for her hand, a simple gesture laden with reassurance and continuity, and Margaret intertwined her fingers with his, letting herself feel the warmth and stability of a presence earned rather than assumed. The gardens, meticulously maintained yet alive with the subtle chaos of nature, mirrored the life they were building. Deliberate yet flexible, structured yet nurturing. Margaret's mind drifted to the past, the years of silent dinners, cold corridors, and invisible mornings. She had carried the weight of neglect for so long, believing that love could be measured in proximity and provision. Yet, here amid the quiet beauty of their co-created world, she understood that love was not a static gift, but a choice made daily consciously with attention and care. The recognition that Henry was now willing to make that choice and to allow her to do the same brought a profound sense of peace. In the studio later that afternoon, they worked side by side, occasionally exchanging glances or brushing hands as they passed materials. Margaret paused, letting herself observe Henry in this ordinary yet extraordinary role, attentive, curious, responsive. He asked her opinion, sought her input, and acted with consideration for her vision, no longer imposing his authority or judgment. She felt a subtle, steady joy rise in her chest. This was love expressed through consistency, through the small but meaningful decisions, to engage, to communicate, to participate fully in each other's lives. Henry broke the silence, at one point, his voice low and tender. "Margaret, I know I can't undo the past, but I want to choose differently every day. Even the small things, even the mundane moments. I want to show up for you, for us." Margaret smiled, a warmth spreading through her that was not merely relief but a deep-seated contentment. "I see that, Henry, and I want the same for us every day. Not perfection, just presence, honesty, and attention. That's what matters." As the evening descended, they prepared a simple dinner together, chopping vegetables, arranging plates, and sharing quiet jokes. The routine felt comforting, the repetition not tedious but grounding. Margaret realized that these small, ordinary acts, once overlooked, once taken for granted, now carried profound significance. Each meal shared, each conversation held with attention, each brushstroke in the studio was a choice to nurture love rather than neglect it. After dinner, they walked through the penthouse gardens, the city lights glittering faintly in the distance, mingling with the soft glow of the landscaping. Margaret paused, taking in the moment, the clarity of the present and the deliberate care they were investing in each other. She felt a sense of gratitude, not for grandeur or luxury, but for the commitment to presence, the decision to engage, and the willingness to be vulnerable and open. Henry's arm found hers naturally, their hands entwining without conscious thought. "Happiness," he murmured, "is not a destination, but a journey chosen together, hand in hand, heart to heart." Margaret pressed her head lightly against his shoulder, breathing in the quiet strength of his presence. She felt the steady rhythm of their mutual commitment, the comfort of shared vulnerability, and the thrill of anticipation for the life they were now choosing to build day by day. Their laughter, their quiet conversations, their shared work, and even the mundane tasks were now infused with intention and care, forming the foundation of a love both resilient and tender. As they paused to watch the city below, the reflections of light dancing on the glass and water, Margaret understood that their journey was ongoing. There would be challenges, missteps, and moments of doubt, but now they had learned the rhythm of choice, the power of presence, and the extraordinary impact of ordinary gestures made with intention. The future stretched before them wide and open, and for the first time, she felt fully ready to walk it hand in hand with Henry, heart in heart, each day, a deliberate act of love. And as the night settled around the penthouse with the gentle hum of the city below and the soft glow of their shared home, Margaret allowed herself to lean into the warmth, peace, and certainty that the journey they had begun together was real, chosen, and enduring. Sometimes healing begins where we least expect it, hidden in the quiet moments we share, in the courage to speak our truth, or in the small gestures that say, "I see you." Margaret's journey reminds us that being present and truly acknowledging another person's heart is more powerful than any wealth, status, or grand gesture. It is in the daily choices, the listening, the noticing, the small acts of care that love and connection are built. We also learn that visibility matters. To be seen for who we truly are beyond titles, roles, or appearances is a gift we can give one another and a right we must claim for ourselves. Even after years of distance, absence, or neglect, it is never too late to open the door to vulnerability, compassion, and authentic presence. Life does not wait for perfection, and love does not demand it. It asks only that we choose to show up every day for ourselves and for those who matter most. In the end, real connection is not about grand moments, but about courage, attention, and the gentle persistence of choosing one another, hand in hand, heart to heart. Thank you for being here with us. Your presence means more than words can express, and every moment you spend listening, reflecting, and feeling with us is a gift. Every like, share, and subscribe helps us tell more stories that touch the soul, stories that remind us of compassion, connection, and the quiet power of being seen. From all of us at Shining Stories, thank you for choosing to share this journey and for helping us bring light, hope, and humanity into the world, one story at a time.